Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate the invitation to come, and thank you for braving both the weather and HS2 to get to the Royal Asiatic Society. I want to start by showing you just how bad Afghan democracy is by taking you to a ballot paper from Kabul on October the 20th this year. If you had been in Kabul, and I want to imagine, if you can imagine you were in Kabul on October the 20th this year, having queued up for hours, you go into the polling station and get your register ticked off, and the ink on your finger. You can see the chap looking at the ballot paper with the ink on his finger. You're then faced with, and I may not show you the whole of it, but you're then faced with this. It goes on for 127 pages, 800 names, more than 800 names for Kabul. And, so just to sort of stop in the middle of the page, to interrogate this, if you don't, and as I don't very well, I have the reading age of about a 5-year-old, but these are the names. You'll see on the left, even if you don't read the Urdu script, the Pashto script, Dari script, those are all the same, and what they say is independent candidate. So for more than 800 names, you have in nearly every case independent candidate. For reasons I'll describe, parties don't appear on the ballot paper. You do get a photograph, so you've got a sense of the person you might vote for. The symbols on the left don't actually distinguish any particular party. They're issued at random to election candidates who then have the election campaign period to persuade their people what their symbol looks like. And they get issued a symbol, and if they don't like the symbol, then they only get 3 dips into the pot, as it were. They're voting for, and it goes on for 800, more than 800 names. You can see a few women appearing, quite a few women candidates, in fact, during this election. What you're electing is 33 MPs in a single constituency. So you have one vote for one person in a multi-member constituency. And the bottom 11 of those MPs, as it were, the first women are there, all have to be women. So 11 of the 33 have to be women. 1/3 of the Afghan House constitutionally has to be women. But that means that by an aberration, you get women elected for many, many fewer votes than men right across the country. And you get all sorts of peculiar aberrations that build into the system. It's known as the single non-transferable vote system. It's operated, apart from the upper house of Japan, as far as I know, only in Taiwan and Jordan. No functioning democracies anywhere in the world use the SNTV system for multi-party, for multi-member constituencies. Single constituency, multi-member, one vote. So it goes on, more than 800 names. So there you are in the polling station, trying to find. You're illiterate. You haven't got much time. It's wet outside. Trying to find, either recognise the name or find the symbol that you might happen to have known about as to who this person are. Independent candidate, independent candidate, independent candidate. I talked to a BBC producer I used to work with very closely about the election, and he said in the polling station there were people asking him what should they do? Could he find their candidate for them? And of course the election officials understandably were saying to this journalist, keep out. But he was saying, well, they don't know what they're doing. They're not being assisted in this. It goes on, more than 800 names. So I think you get the picture. This is what it was like on October the 20th. It's pretty confused. It was insisted on, interestingly, by this SNTV system back in 2004 by Zalmay Khalilzad, who was President Bush's envoy to Afghanistan, former Afghan citizen himself, and now President Trump's peace envoy to trying to negotiate peace with the Taliban. So he's a man who's very confident of his own opinions. When there were more sensible people, it goes on, you see, it goes on and on, where there were more sensible people internationally who said, this system won't work, and it was Karzai who significantly pushed it through, with the support of Karzai, who never wanted a functioning democracy and never wanted opposition to develop. So anyway, I think we might have had enough of the ballot paper. I just want to go on, if I can, to a slightly less frantic PowerPoint. Voting was, rather popular in Afghanistan. So that's in order to that's the Kabul streets in the weeks before the election itself. So in order to get your man or woman, the identity of your man or woman, better known, there's huge amounts of money spent on billboards and posters, and a huge amount of sort of jockeying for position. But really, given that there aren't any parties standing, or very, very few, and I'll explain why in a minute, individuals with party names next to them, what you end up with is encouraging clientelism and patronage. You encourage people to trade favours for votes, to turn every single MP effectively into something like a cost centre, trading promises and favours for votes and for cash. And given the carnival atmosphere, really, people queuing up to vote in Afghanistan, there's no doubt that voting's popular, but there are plenty of reports suggesting that although people in the new Afghanistan like to feel they're being consulted, I want to argue that this is something of a facade, not a democracy in any meaningful sense, and the lack of political parties across this system is partly to blame for the problem. I will argue that the failure to develop normal political parties united by ideology of class or interest, as we have in functioning democracies, although you could argue about whether we're in a functioning democracy at the moment, but as we do have in functioning democracies, goes deep into the 20th century history of Afghanistan. It's not just post-2001, and it partly contributed to the collapse into civil war more than 40 years ago. So in my view, this really matters. There are some parties today, but the most baleful sort of consequence of the failure to establish normal political parties in Afghanistan is that nearly all of the most influential parties are formed from the old warlords from the 1980s. Mujahideen, whose tribe or war record mattered more than policy differences between them. With the Wallace II Jirga election, the election for the lower house of parliament out the way, attention now turns to the presidential election next year. And the main recent political event in Kabul was the launch of the so-called Grand National Coalition. These are some of the key figures, and they're all either leaders from the 1980s, well-known leaders from the 1980s, or the sons of leaders from the 1980s, or brothers. So Zahir Shah on the left, brother of Ahmad Shah Massoud, the main Tajik commander, the main northern Tajik commander, Salahuddin Rabbani, the son of the founder of the Jamiat party, and Mohammed Atta-Noor, the governor of Balkh, another very significant Tajik Jamiat commander. So Jamiat very well represented. General Dostum, who's changed size more than anybody else in Afghanistan, going right back to the 1970s, when he was trained by the Russians as an Afghan soldier. But he's now in this, although he serves in the government as the first vice president to President Ghani, and in the middle, Mahakek, who was one of the most significant Hazara commanders from the Hazara tribe during the 1980s. So either warlords or the sons or brothers of warlords represent the Grand National Coalition, which may form the opposition to President Ghani next year. And this is why I move on to scraps of paper. It's a remarkable fact that next year there will be people voting for the first time who weren't born at 9/11. They don't know who these people are. They don't have the track record that the country has in terms of what they're doing. And the only thing that unites these people is not policy, but their opposition to President Ghani. Their ties to each other are a coalition of convenience to secure access to power and to the patronage that comes with it in Afghanistan. And I might say that President Ghani and the technocrats around him have no more interest in forming political parties than the former warlords. The Wallace II Jirga election this year was the first for 8 years. delayed because of arguments about registering voters and modalities of holding the election, process, not policy. And Ashraf Ghani was not in the country before 2001. He would have had plenty of time since 2014 to form a political movement. Look at what President Macron has done in France. But he didn't take this opportunity, and perhaps you can think about why he might have done that. Now that having got on off these scraps of paper, I don't know where I am. There he is. But this feels like a bit of a betrayal of the hopes of Afghans right across society. I want to, forgive me, having ripped up this bit of paper, I've lost. Oh, there it is. I want to look at the nature of the democracy that's been introduced since 9/11, where politicians are not really accountable to voters in Afghanistan in the way that they are in the West, since most of the money they spend comes from Western countries. So we'll come on to that in a minute, but first a dig down into history, and I wonder whether there is actually something in Afghan society that prevents the growth of political parties. So it might be that Afghan traditional decision-making is oppositional to democracy. There are several elements of Afghan traditional culture that are well known, at least to an audience like this. The circles of loyalty through family, clan, tribe and ethnic group provide a glue that is highly supportive, and actually more so than any networks in the West, and does help resilience at times of shock over the last 30, 40 years. It's one of the reasons why in many places Afghan society has held together. But although this has been useful in managing the upheavals of the last 40 years, a number of observers have witnessed a degradation to these structures. Even before the Taliban, there was, for example, a loss of control by traditional centres of Sufi authority for a harder line Islamic approach to life. And the refugee experience has further loosened old ties in Afghanistan. So we don't want to be too sentimental about the traditional bonds in the country. It's well known, too, that decisions have been made traditionally in jirgas and shuras, so-called, at local levels. Although there's some evidence that some of those gatherings since 2001 were called by international NGOs. So they were called because villages knew that this was the way to get international money. The international community was coming in and wanted a jirga, so let's give them one. So there was a sense of that maybe this too was not as important a traditional gathering as we had suspected. Furthermore, there's the national lawyer jirga, the grand jirga, the large jirga, literally a meeting of all of the jirgas. But again, the time-honoured nature of this tradition, I think, is relatively open to question. There was a lawyer jirga in 1747 to endorse the coronation of the first king of Afghanistan with a wreath of wheat, the symbol that appears in the middle of the Afghan national flag. But this wasn't a national gathering of tribes. It was just a Pashtun Kandahari event. It wasn't, and in fact, the first record of a multi-tribal national lawyer jirga was not until the 20th century. And then, during the 20th century, these were not deliberative decision-making bodies, but to secure consent at a time of crisis or at a time of reform. So the 20th century lawyer jirgas, to quickly go through them, were in 1915, the first of the so-called, my definition, crisis lawyer jirgas, to keep Afghanistan out of the First World War and endorse King Habibullah's decision to stay out of it. The second one was to ratify the coronation of Nadir Shah, the general who took control after the deposing of King Amanullah in 1928. And then there was a further lawyer jirga held to keep Afghanistan out of the Second World War, to keep Afghanistan neutral. And finally, the last of the so-called crisis lawyer jirgas in the 20th century, a declaration about Pashtunistan after the crisis that happened when Pakistan emerged as a separate country to the east of Afghanistan, and Afghanistan feared the Durand Line becoming, as it has done in the international sense, an international border. The so-called reform lawyer Jirgas, my definition again, were the three held by Amanullah to secure consent for his reforms in the 1920s. One in 1964 to ratify a relatively democratic constitution, in fact the constitution that the 2004 constitution was based on. I'll come back to that in a minute. And one in 1977 to ratify a much less democratic constitution. But none of these lawyer Jirgas were deliberative decision-making bodies. And in fact, it wasn't until after 9/11 that you had the real sense of lawyer Jirgas that did actually begin to make decisions. So in a way, we came in putting a mask over democracy, in a sense, in Afghanistan. Although we wanted a new start with democratic institutions, we wanted it done sort of in the Afghan way. So there was quite a lot of effort put into these lawyer Jirgas that then really did begin to make some decisions. The emergency lawyer Jirga, so-called 2002, the Taliban not included. Many people now believe that was a mistake. The constitutional lawyer Jirga, which took decisions about forming the constitution that emerged. And then there was a lawyer Jirga in 2010 to discuss potential reconciliation with the Taliban. And finally, there was a lawyer Jirga in 2013 called by President Karzai to keep foreign troops out of the country at the end of combat operations in 2014. Now, this was a personal decision by President Karzai, and he secured the consent of the tribes to get it. It was easily reversed by President Ghani on his first day in office in September 2014, the first decision made by the new government, and he didn't need a lawyer Jirga to change his mind. So there was no sense that Afghanistan was crying out for lawyer Jirgas to change the decisions. In less than 2 decades then, national multi-tribal lawyer Jirgas have been rather more frequent in the supposedly modern democratic post-9/11 Afghanistan than before. I just want to look at one other further question as to whether this traditional thing could be preventing democracy. Is democracy really compatible with Islam? Now, I'm not an expert, but there are many ways of delivering Islam. In the past, it has insisted on obedience to authority, but far from being in opposition, the Islamic scholar Olivier Roy sees modern Islamic movements, in particular since the Arabic Spring, as interdependent with democracy. He sees modern Islamism as becoming much more hierarchical at the time when it's leaving the state to operate in its own sphere, particularly in a world where TV and the internet have challenged all forms of traditional authority. So imams and sheikhs do not speak with one voice in Afghanistan. And I think you couldn't easily make a very strong argument to say that deliberative decision-making bodies formed with political parties, voted on one member, one vote, one person, one vote outside parliaments, are inimical with a functioning Islam and a constitution, as Afghanistan has, with Sharia law right at the centre of it. So what happened in the 20th century that, in my view, prevented the formation of political parties and led to and contributed in no small measure to the move towards the chaos that began in the late 1970s and that we're now beginning to try and sort out? It's very much my view that democracy is not merely desirable but achievable in Afghanistan, and not in opposition to traditional ways of life, as I've tried to show. But during the 20th century, the development of democratic institutions always took second place to economic reform, right from the 1920s onwards. So King Amanullah in the 1920s, as we've seen, secured lawyer Jirga consent, not democratic consent, for his reform programme. And in 1928, the year before he was deposed, having returned from Europe, he proposed the formation of a party of independence and reform, but lacking any of the sort of institutions that a party would vote for, lacking any institutional framework of a functioning legislature. It was not really a political party. Following him, there was the Musaybin dynasty, and after the violence of the 1929 revolution, Nadir Shah lasted just 4 years and was succeeded by his son, aged 19, Zahir Shah. His uncles initially ran the government for him, and although they introduced a constitution in 1933, it had no democratic pretensions. They weren't looking for votes, they weren't looking for consent in order to manage the country. They calculated that the worst threat to their rule would be an alliance between a disaffected rural population and a conservative Islamic establishment, just the alliance, intriguingly, that the Taliban put together in order to secure the wins that they got in Afghanistan, that link between the mullahs and rural conservative thinking. So the Mosabins, rather than looking for democratic consent, cut rural taxes and instead imposed taxes on trade, foreign aid and the control of monopolies, which were decisions taken without a parliament to win consent for them. And in the second half of the 20th century, before the Taliban emerged, the threat that ultimately destabilised Afghanistan didn't come from the rural countryside. It came from literate urban elites who were cut out of the democratic decisions because there weren't democratic decisions being made, who were cut out of the decisions in the country and demanded political reform. Throughout Zahir Shah's rule, they never had the outlets of political parties, the pressure valve, if you like, of normal civil society politics, public debate, or a free press. That most acute observer of Afghanistan, Louis Dupré, if you can read that, commented, the government, this is the royal government, refused to believe that the Liberals merely want to liberalise the existing government, and they look on all opposition as preparation for overthrow. So any kind of dissent during the royal period, even under Zahir Shah, was seen as something that would ultimately bring down the government. During the period of Zahir Shah, there was, just after the Second World War, the beginnings of democracy for the first time. The first democratic election, 1949, it did allow political parties to run, and in fact around half of the members of that Wallace II Jirga were from two reform parties, with liberal, anti-monarchist reviews reflected in the newspapers that they founded when the press was free just 2 years later. But it couldn't last, and of course in the following year there was a crackdown both on the media and on other forms of dissent. And intriguingly, for any student of Afghan history, one of the people who was arrested in the 1950 crackdown was Babrak Kemal, who later of course founded the Communist Party and became leader of the country after the Russian invasion. But the experience of 1949 to 1952 strengthened, if anything, the royal family's opposition to the growth of democratic parties. So when in 1964 there was a new constitution, the first really democratic constitution since 1949, and a much more of a modern look at Afghanistan, it had a provision for political parties, but that was not ratified by Zahir Shah. He chose instead to ignore that provision in a decision that, in my view, proved fateful to Afghanistan. His focus was not on the politics in the raw sense of arguments over spending priorities, the provision of state services, the kind of things that politicians deal with in democratic countries. He was more interested in the institutional framework. He wanted to keep his cousin Daud Shah, who became ultimately Daud Khan, out of power, and through doing that was keeping members of the royal family out of the cabinet, and that was his only interest. Appointing his own cabinet rather than securing democratic consent was the aim of Zahir Shah. And ominously, politics began to be something that was happening outside the emerging political institutions. So in January 1965, just a year after the constitution emerges, we have the creation, formed in secret, of the PDPA, the Afghan Communist Party, by Babrak Kemal and Nur Mohammad Taraki. They split quite soon after, but back in the 1960s, they were together. Well, in 1973, Daud Khan did take over in a bloodless coup while Zahir Shah was having dental treatment in Italy. And he had no more interest in encouraging democracy than Zahir Shah had. He cracked down first on Islamists, which is when many of those who would later lead the Mujahideen fled to Pakistan, and Daud then turned on the communists, including those like Babrak Kemal, who'd supported his takeover. In 1977, Daud puts together a constitution for a one-party state, much more centralised than the 1964 constitution, under his so-called National Revolutionary Party. That's the symbol of the National Revolutionary Party, in a view of Afghanistan that was secular, progressive in his view, non-communist, but non-democratic, in many ways echoing what King Amanullah curiously had done in the 1920s in a very different kind of political setting. And he and his constitution were swept aside just a year later by a communist revolution that began Afghanistan's long conflict, the tragic sequence of communist revolution, Soviet invasion, Mujahideen insurgency, civil war between the Mujahideen, and then the Taliban, the decades of darkness that followed when there was really no opening for democracy. So how have we got to that appalling ballot paper 18 years after American soldiers first arrived in Afghanistan in 2001? A really not functioning system built for the lower house of the Afghan parliament. Well, there was a fresh start, obviously, in 2001 when the Americans arrived, but in the absence of political parties, powerful elites co-opted the system very quickly and were supported up to a point by the international community, who saw particularly the Americans, who saw the jihadis as their friends from back in the day when they'd been backing them against the communists. Trying to keep the communists out of Afghanistan was such a strong sense of American foreign policy back in the 1980s that supporting the Mujahideen really mattered. And the Taliban was seen as uniquely evil. The jihadis were seen as America's friends. And it meant that you had traditional warlord power bases that were, if anything, strengthened after 9/11. The people who'd lost out to the Taliban in 1996 returned quickly to power, and what you had in the democratic structures that were put in were just an alternative. They weren't seen as either or. They were seen as both and by power brokers across Afghanistan. You needed both to have, your, as it were, warlord capacity, and if you could, have some influence in the parliament. By 2014, Afghans interviewed for a study by Noah Coburn and Anna Larson generally saw elections as conferring power for patronage purposes, not to enshrine liberal values such as free speech. So the general view of people voting, although they're optimistic voting and felt that they had a say, was that this was just putting in another group of people who would be as corrupt as the last elite. Now, this didn't mean that traditional elders could guarantee to get their people into the Wallace II Jirga. In the 2005 election, for example, the Al-Karzais failed to win any seats in the Kandahar province, although the Al-Karzais are one of the most significant tribes in the province. Ownership of land and water systems was the basis of control, and many of those systems had broken down as the tribal system had broken down up to a point. Afghanistan was left then with neither a functioning multi-party system nor functioning traditional authority. Former President Karzai played a significant role in this post-9/11 world and the failure to develop political parties. He governed like an old-fashioned centralist monarch, responsive to the demands of tribes, but resistant to the separation of powers necessary for a modern state. And he blocked the transparent register of voters all the way through his time of office. The first computerized identity card system finally began collecting data this year, but not in time for the Wallace II Jirga elections. There were some other reform opportunities. The A3 group, so-called, Afghanistan Awareness and Analysis, and the 1400 group of young urban reformist intellectuals. 1400, by the way, refers to the year 1400 in the Afghan calendar, which begins in April 2021. When they started the 1400 group back in 2013, 2014, they thought, well, about 8 years on, perhaps we've matured enough to form a political party that could run for office. Well, we don't look as if we're anywhere near there. Obstacles to starting a political party are formidable. and remain formidable. A 2003 law allowed for political parties but didn't define a political role for them. And you couldn't back then put the name of the political party on a ballot paper. They were registered. You could register after a cumbersome process inside the Ministry of Justice. And that's where I have to move to another page. Isn't it? Oh. Go on, it may not matter. If I find it, I'll give it to you. But the sense of the lack of functioning, the lack of party identity on ballot papers remaining a significant hurdle to the reason why people would campaign for political parties. And it also remained a high bar to building a functioning party system. Inside the Wallace II Jirga itself, there was a process to register so-called groups. You couldn't sort of form a political party in the Wallace II Jirga, but after 2004 you could register as a group, which needed 21 members as a minimum. With 249 members, this was less than 10% of the chamber, so a relatively easy bar to cross, you'd have thought. To encourage coalitions of interest to develop within the Wallace II Jirga, if you were in a group, you couldn't be members of a single tribe, gender or ethnic identity, which blocked the old jihadi parties. And one group of left-leaning modernists led by Shukriya Barakzai did really survive during the long years of the Parliament up until now, although most of the others who registered had little meaning or life because Parliament was seen as a collection of individuals, of individual cost centres, rather than as political parties. And the final obstacle to meaningful elections, in my view, and the development of oppositional politics is the nature of Afghan democracy itself, the democracy that we brought to Afghanistan after 9/11. The country's continued dependence on international funding, its status as a sort of rentier state where the rents come from donors outside the country, has led to an inversion, if you like, of Jefferson's condition of democracy, that there should be no taxation without representation. In Afghanistan, there is representation without taxation. Neither the President nor the Wallace II Jirga are accountable to voters in the normal democratic sense. And faced by extreme inertia against either transparent elections or developing a system that encourages the growth of political parties, and guided by the mantra that the international community would hold its nose and pay for the process because these had to be Afghan-led and Afghan-owned in the system, it meant that that Afghanistan failed to develop the democratic political parties that you would need in a functioning democracy. It's perhaps the international funding is the only reason why this whole thing hasn't broken down completely. Its inadequacies are hidden because of American largesse. But history has some sharp lessons, and the impatience of educated, unemployed youth deprived of a political route to change in the 1960s and 1970s precisely mirrors the problems that Afghanistan faces today. And if there is no organised political system where parties operate, then the only avenue for dissent may be outside Parliament, encouraging extremist thought and extremist action, which I think is what we're seeing in the streets of Kabul and other Afghan cities. And I will pause there for questions.
Thank you very much.
If I ever find page 11,
Thank you very much for that fantastic overview. And I would just like to say I'm extremely pleased that you seem to have honed in on something that I have also felt for a long time was an issue, that sort of lack of the fundamental contract that we all hate of paying taxes to give us a control over the government that we have. And the disconnect between tax revenue and government authority in Afghanistan goes back a long way. In the 1920s, land tax revenue covered most of the costs of domestic government. By the 1950s, it covered nothing, and it was international aid from then on, in one way or another. So I think it's absolutely right but it is an inherited problem as well as one arising out of the post-Taliban era. That's enough from me. Can I take questions from the floor, please? Yeah, 1, 2.
KB, former soldier.
Yep.
Could you say something about your prognosis about the potential integration of the Taliban into this political system? If talks were successful, and whether you think talks will be successful?
My view is that it's going to. I'd say the whole talks process is as we know, it's been pushed quite quickly by the Americans, by Zahir Shah. My view is that it's going to take them longer than they think to really secure what they want. There's a certain, this is the way that President Trump does business. Go there, do the deal. And if anyone's going to do it, I think he thought that Karzai would. He knows the country well. He and Ashraf Ghani were 1 year apart in school. They've known each other literally all their lives. And in fact, were both one succeeded the other in American scholarships abroad back in the 1970s. And Ashraf Ghani liked to tell me the story that one of the conditions of the scholarship was that when you went abroad for your university degree, you had to come back to Afghanistan for a certain period. I think it was 3 years. And he did that with his new wife from Beirut, who he met on his scholarship. And Zahir Shah didn't. He didn't fulfill this condition. He remained in the United States. So Ghani thinks he's a more honourable character. But anyway, so Karzai may be the person who can bang heads together and bring something close, although there's some indications that he's moving far too quickly for the Taliban, and he's certainly moving too quickly for the Afghan government, who are on a much slower consensus-building process. But were we to get to the point that Karzai clearly wants, which is perhaps a new constitutional law jirga, some sense of giving the Taliban some say in being able to amend the constitution, although it's hard to see how they could amend the Afghan constitution in a more Islamic way. It has Sharia law as the ultimate authority in the constitution as written. But there may be some face-saving formula that could give the Taliban the capacity to say that we won. We amended the Afghan constitution. Some sense of a withdrawal agreement for US troops, and then you would have actually, I think, what the IRA have been facing in Northern Ireland and Sinn Féin have been facing in Northern Ireland, which is, when you actually run things, it gets quite complicated. It's all very well being a rebel, but the places where the Taliban are under control and under authority, things don't operate very well. A number of even places where they're able up to a point to draw down government with funds, but they're not very good administrators. They weren't particularly good administrators back in the 1990s when they were running the country. So I think if they become just another political party, then we'll see. But it could be that there is a space for Taliban individuals standing as independents within this system. Although, it's quite hard to get elected in this system. All these weird aberrations that happen. In 2005, all of the members of the Wallace II Jirga from Ghazni province were Hazaras, from the Hazara minority. Now, there are quite a lot of Hazaras in Ghazni, but it's probably less than 50%. And so you get these strange aberrations in the system that we've got at the moment. So, in terms of the substance of my lecture, I think it would be quite hard for the Taliban to make headway in the system in Afghanistan as it is at the moment. But let's see, what concessions need to be made along the way. And Ashraf Ghani and the new reformers and women in Afghanistan are not going to allow any concessions to be made in terms of social progress that's been made since 2001. And my understanding is that there are many people in the Taliban who accept that.
3 questions already. Lady on the front row here, then Victoria Schofield, and then Nicholas Barrington.
Yeah, I have 2 questions, if that's all right. The first one, you sort of briefly talked about the coalition that's going to happen between, trying to form an opposition party. The warlords that you mentioned there, General Dostum and Mahaki, for example, are sort of in history have been enemies in a sense that they're from different ethnic groups. What do you think is the main reason for them that now they want to become an opposition party against Ghani himself? And the other question was that you sort of mentioned that Ghani would like to compare himself to Karzai. Do you think, if any, how successful were they in trying to implement democracy and fairness in Afghanistan? Because if you look at the history of Afghanistan, we see systemic discrimination against certain ethnicity, for example, the Hazaras, for centuries. And the Hazaras still claim that they're still being systematically discriminated. So do you think any of them have been successful in trying to get rid of that?
If I could, if I could pick up the second half of that first. I think the Ghani administration, has done everything it can to try and reassure the Hazara community that there isn't discrimination. So he was facing 2 years ago this so-called enlightened awakening movement of people who said, if there's going to be electricity coming across the country, it's going the wrong way, it's got to cross Bamiyan. And he spent a lot of time persuading Hazaras that he was on their side and building it. There's a major new infrastructure project to the north of Bamiyan, road system and electricity, which will come to that area. So I think there are efforts being made by this administration to persuade the whole country that it is multi-ethnic, multi-tribal. Although one of the rather baleful things that's said about it is that things are becoming more ethnically divided. And it's wrongly said, and I worked in the presidential palace, I know this is not true, but it's wrongly said outside the system at the top that you have to be a Pashtun in order to achieve in the Ghani administration. So there's a very common sense in Afghanistan that Ghani is becoming isolated just as a Pashtun. And to your first question, the Grand National Coalition needs to come together to unite because they think it's the only way of defeating him. They haven't yet got their presidential candidate. The general rule in Afghanistan is you need to be a Pashtun to lead the country, and there isn't a prominent Pashtun at the top of the Grand National Coalition at this stage. So they haven't named somebody, but there's also another sort of historical rule that members of the Royal Society of Asian Affairs would have known well in the 19th century, that it was always said about Afghans that they will unite against a foreign invader or an opposition and divide as soon as that moment's over. So I don't expect that Dostum will be an ally of Mahakek and the Jamiat for any longer than he was an ally of anybody else through the years that he's taken Junbish along this line of alliances from the Soviet Union through the Mujahideen, through a number of different alliances over the years. So I won't be leaving afterwards.
Victoria.
Thank you, Dave. You said at the beginning that Karzai never wanted a functioning democracy. Do you think we, the West, US, Britain, bear some responsibility for not understanding, and given the history you've just gone through of Afghanistan's tribal complexities, do we bear some responsibility for trying to force through a system that was just never going to work?
I don't think we did try and force through a system successfully enough. We didn't force through a functioning democracy. Either you have multi-party constituencies with with multi-member constituencies with proportional representation, with some sense of understanding, which way your vote goes. Single transferable vote or PR. There's various PR systems. If you're going to have a multi-member constituency, but once we got into SNTV with multi-member constituencies, and we allowed to happen, and didn't insist on a much better ID. So Karzai controlled the registry of voters from the very beginning, and there was a time. There were about 2 million bits of biometric data from returning refugees. The UN had tremendous high-quality biometric data on people who'd come back because they did iris scans and fingerprints on people, so they didn't get rations twice when they returned to get ration packs or whatever when they'd returned across particularly from Pakistan. But Karzai and a lot of people around him prevented the international community, some people in the international community, from saying that we wanted to use that system, that biometric data that already existed, as the beginnings of an ID system. It's taken until 2018 for biometric data and ID systems to operate. I mean, there's one other problem which will be quite well known to some people in this room, which is there are many people in Afghanistan, particularly Hazaras, who don't want the identifier Afghan on their identity card. So although they're citizens of Afghanistan, being called an Afghan means you're a Pashtun in Afghan history. So there was a long argument over securing the demands of a number of minority tribes that their tribal identity, if they're going to be called Afghans, they would also be called whatever it was. It's slightly reminiscent of the Arab American, African American sort of debate that goes on. Yeah.
My hero in that earlier thing was a man called Musa Shafiq Kamawi, who was responsible for that earlier.
The 1964.
1964, because the king was concerned to stop. The country was completely run by the family before, and he was determined to break through. And Kamawi had high Islamic connections. He'd been at Al-Azhar and also Westerners, trying to build that bridge. But as you say, they didn't have the courage to allow political parties. And so the thing got either the communists, the liberals went more left, and the Islamics became very.
Well, I'm glad. So you sort of agree with me, Nicholas, that there was that was a moment of failure in a sense. That feels like sort of the.
And yet, I mean, they were moving that way. Kamawi was beginning to get it back on the way. But I mean, he had a lot of influence and so on. But then Daud came back. Daud was after power. He's now treated as a hero by some people in Afghanistan. Yeah. But he wanted power really, and he only came in because he had these leftist army officers. On his side, of course.
Yeah. And he didn't have civil society or functioning parliament.
No,
in any way.
He made some concessions to the Islamic, to the liberals, in schools and so on, and that was great. But then, of course, you have the question of resisting the communists. So the mullahs, people turn to the mullahs as a national identity against getting out. The British behaved disgracefully. Remember, they killed a whole lot of educated people around the country. Yeah. One talks about the evils of the Mujahideen, but the communists in the beginning were absolutely dreadful, the things they did. But those Mujahideen, they were not, as we think of it, Islamic extremists who wanted to turn the whole world into Islam. They were wanting to bring Islam because that was their traditional background.
Some of them did, and some of them.
Ones. Well, Hekmatyar, he was all right as somebody's making power for himself.
Yes.
And so, I mean, the question of the relation to, what you're talking about is interesting, how politics is developed. But there's still the thing about Islam and moderate Islam, and people have the courage to say that we've got to build bridges, and that presumably is the question of bringing in the Taliban. How can the Taliban be persuaded to moderate their ideas of Islam to bring it into a more...
Well, I think one other answer to the soldier's question before is the 3-day ceasefire this year brought Taliban into the cities, and they saw for the first time what it's really like, being relatively open, being able to wander around, apparently all they wanted to do is to eat ice cream and have selfies with girls, and this sort of sense of a different kind of society. And very often, if you read Jonathan Powell's rather good book on peace negotiations, there's one, I think it's Colombia, where the really key breakthrough was when they took these people who'd lived in the forest for years and years and years to a 5-star hotel in an American city, and showed that actually, this wasn't that bad really. And it may be that there's some of that needs to go on with the Taliban. Of course, their negotiators live in Doha, so they do know what functioning air conditioning can bring.
The tragedy now is still a huge number of Afghan police and soldiers are dying in the present.
I agree. So
I've now got 5.
Room full of
5 people asking questions. So, gentleman in the centre here first.
Can you say a bit about the position of the media? I mean, you talked about the absence of a free press, or the difficulties in establishing a free press. Now, with the proliferation of channels, radio, television, and so on, and is that not possibly a contributor to the formation of a more effective democracy, the fact that you've got the potential for
it might only lend to frustration if you don't then have something you can take that channel into if there aren't other functioning civil society institutions. The Afghan media, the building of the Afghan media since 2001 has been a huge success story. British money went in to train lots of Afghan journalists, lots of American money funding news agencies, TV stations. Initially, Tolo TV survived for years on purely on foreign aid, and has now become a really successful, powerful media house, selling its own, exporting its own translated programs, bringing lots of people in for debate programs, but they're not particularly edifying, some of them, and they don't have the rest of the functioning civil society process, particularly a functioning democracy, for an outlet for those demands that emerge in talk shows and in the constant argument programs that go on television. All it does is to fuel frustration in a way. Although the Afghan media are tremendous, brave. I've worked among them as a BBC journalist, and they're an extraordinary sort of tribute to the desire of many people in Afghanistan to really live in a slightly different society from the one they do.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was really informing. The question that I have is you said that the absence of political parties in Afghanistan is the reason behind the failure of democracy. I mean, given that we had the political parties, to what extent do you reckon that political elites from other minorities will be able to hold the power rather than Pashtuns?
Well, I think intriguingly, every single presidential candidate always seems to have. It's become now the norm since President Karzai. So there you are as the prominent Pashtun, but you have the first vice president and second vice president, and they tend to be one Hazara, one Tajik, and connected with on the whole connected with former jihadi parties, which are the only other previously functioning institutions. So. And there are a number of particularly Hazara women in very prominent positions in Afghan life. I think 90% of the young women training in the British-funded Officers Training Academy for the Afghan Army are Hazaras, partly because of the openness of that community in wanting women to share in society. So there are a number of opportunities for minority tribes in Afghanistan, but I agree with you. It's a system which, if you don't have parties that operate in a way that you where your vote's going, which at the moment it's a bit of a lottery. But you'll get one vote for 33 potential members in Kabul. You've no idea, and it's very difficult to do tactical voting in those circumstances. So you get elites who buy the capacity to, or try and buy the capacity to rig that system, and you don't get the kind of outlets for functioning, functioning civil society, the sort that might lead to less repression for and less better opportunities for minorities. David,
I just wondered. I know that there was an electoral reform group in Kabul that recommended that a third of the parliament should be elected on a party basis, and that was actually voted down, or it was not accepted by Ghani and Abdullah and so on. So there is quite a lot of opposition amongst those who have power at the moment.
Yes. I think Ghani and Abdullah are as opposed to this as curiously as Karzai was.
So where is we analyse this as being a necessity of party politics. Where is the support for this coming from within Afghan society? Because that seems to be an issue. How are there groups within Afghan society who would like to see parties? And if not, do you see any reforms to the present system which might remove this kind of ridiculous approach that you've illustrated to make the whole thing work a bit better, even if you don't have parties?
Well, I think two simple reforms would change things. Firstly, if you want multi-member constituencies, then you have to have some kind of proportional representation system or single transferable vote or something that's a bit more predictable than the lottery that it is at the moment. And secondly, not only allowing, which has been allowed since 2009, that you can put your party name on a document. Most people choose not to. Not only allowing it, but encouraging it by changing the rules inside the Wallace II Jirga so party blocks can actually operate. In the Westminster Parliament, you get money as an opposition party. You get offices. You get the capacity you get supply days. There are things. A whole number of functions built into the legislature which allow for political parties to operate, even though they may be opposed to hold the government to account, even though they may be opposed to the governing party. And I think certainly President Karzai ruled as an old-fashioned emir, as Zahir Shah had, in the sense of being a centralising figure who wanted to work with tribal leaders and didn't want to encourage political dissent to come. So there are now more than 100 political parties that are registered. It's really difficult to register a political party. You used to need only 700 members. You now need 10,000 members and a whole series of other conditions before you can even register. So it's a complex, elaborate, expensive process that needs to be renewed frequently. And even then, it's become. And in fact, they changed it last year. So that of these 110 parties or so, only 5, and I'm grateful to the Afghan Analysts Network, whose chairman is here for this research, only 5 of the 110 political parties managed to get re-registered in time for the Wallace II Jirga election this year. So there were some people on the ballot paper with party names next to them, but it's a complex process. Now, the political parties, not all of whom are A3 and the 1400 group, but do form a whole series of different views right across the country, including quite a number of Islamist parties, quite a number of old-fashioned leftist, as it were, communist parties. They want to see a change under which they could campaign. So they're pushing for it, but they don't have international support. I think this is not something that the international community are very exercised by. And they don't have certainly the support from the old elites who are sitting on this.
How much government space is there now?
About a third of the country.
Really a third?
About. I mean, we used to say. I mean, it's about a third securely held by the government, mostly the cities and the roads, and it's about a third held by the Taliban. And then, if you like, there's about 40% contested in between. I mean, those are very rough figures, Owen. I mean, that's not a fixed amount. The Taliban have been fighting this year significantly to get a proper corridor through from Farah in the southwest, where they're quite prominent, up through to through the northeast, through northern Helmand, Uruzgan and Ghazni, which is why trying to take Ghazni city was so important to them. And securing that corridor would give them significant leverage in terms of the peace talks, which are underway in various formats, certainly, alongside the Zalmay Khalilzad peace talks.
David, thank you very
I will
much.
just before we go.
Your missing page.
Sorry, no, I haven't. I was just going to show you a day at the office, actually. So it's my super selfie, and actually I will just. So Ghani sees himself. This is one interesting thing about Ashraf Ghani. He sees himself as very much completing unfinished business from the 1920s, from the King Amanullah period. And that's that room, you'd recognise it from the other side, because that's where he sits with ambassadors on the other side of that desk. And the desk that we're sitting on is King Amanullah's desk. We just have perched on the desk by this photographer. It's King Amanullah's desk that was sort of dusty and abandoned in an outhouse in the huge presidential palace compound. And when he became president, he got it out and got it restored and works at it every day because he has this sort of sense that that this is unfinished business from the 1920s. Anyway, I thought I'd just share it with you. And finally, just in case you haven't read it, so anyway, thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much indeed. And for the advertising goes with the opportunity to speak. From my position, there are always two problems. One of two problems in like this. One is that the questions dry up and you're desperately trying to find more, looking hopefully around an audience that is ignoring you. And the other is what we have fortunately had this evening, which is more people wanting to ask questions than in the end we've had time for. So those who wished to engage and didn't get the chance, my apologies, but that was a terrific talk, David.